June 6, 1944, about 52, over Normandy, France. The English Channel is a void of black water below, invisible save for the occasional whitecap breaking in the darkness. Above, the sky is a crowded, vibrating ceiling of aluminum and steel. At the head of this mechanical river sits a single aircraft, a Douglas C-47 Skytrain, bearing the serial number 42292847. On its nose, painted in defiant, looping script, is the name "That's all, brother," a message to the Axis powers that their time is running out. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Colonel John M. Donaldson, the command pilot of the 438th Troop Carrier Group, wrestles with the yoke. The air is turbulent, churned up by the wake of the pathfinders who went before and the sheer displacement of the formation behind him. Donaldson is not flying alone. He is the tip of the spear, leading a massive armada of over 800 C-47s, stretching back for miles toward the English coast. Painted with broad black and white invasion stripes on the wings and fuselage, hastily applied wet paint designed to stop Allied gunners from shooting down their own transports, the aircraft is a beacon in the night. But Donaldson's primary concern isn't the paint, it is the timing. He is flying at low altitude, slow and steady, a sitting duck for any German anti-aircraft battery that wakes up. In the fuselage behind him, the roar of the twin engines is deafening, a constant, rattling bass note that vibrates through the metal ribs of the plane. There are no seats for comfort here. Lining the sides of the cargo hold are paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division. They sit on metal bucket seats, weighed down by over 100 pounds of gear, reserve chutes, ammunition, rations, and rifles. The smell is a pungent cocktail of high-octane aviation fuel, sweat, unwashed canvas, and the acrid smoke of nervous cigarettes extinguished moments ago. The crew chief checks the static line cable, a steel wire running the length of the cabin. This is the umbilical cord of the airborne invasion. When the light by the door turns from red to green, these men will hook up and hurl themselves into the void, trusting that the static line will rip their chutes open before they hit the hedgerows of Normandy. At 52 hours, the moment arrives. The throttle is cut back slightly to stabilize the speed. The jump light flashes green. Go, go, go. The stick of paratroopers shuffles rapidly toward the open cargo door, a gaping hole in the side of the fuselage that reveals the chaos of the night. One by one, they vanish into the slipstream, their static lines slapping against the aluminum skin of the aircraft. In seconds, the plane is lighter, surging upward slightly as the human cargo departs to begin the liberation of Europe. This scene, played out in the dark skies over France, was the culmination of an industrial miracle. The aircraft that carried them, the C-47, was not a sleek fighter designed for dogfights, nor a heavy bomber built to level cities. It was a transport, a workhorse, a flying truck. Yet when the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, later tallied the instruments of victory, he did not list the P-51 Mustang or the B-17 Flying Fortress at the top. He named the C-47 Skytrain as one of the 4 most vital pieces of equipment for winning the war. To the men who flew it and the men who rode in it, the plane was known by many names. The British and Commonwealth forces, who received nearly 2,000 of them under Lend-Lease, called it the Dakota, a name that some claim stood for Douglas Aircraft Company Transport Aircraft, though the acronym was likely a happy coincidence. To the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, it was the R-4D, but to the average American GI, affectionately mocking its ungainly appearance on the ground, with its nose pointed skyward and its tail dragging low, it was the Gooney Bird. The nickname belied the aircraft's rugged elegance. The C-47 was a militarized adaptation of the Douglas DC-3, the civilian airliner that had revolutionized air travel in the 1930s. When war broke out, the luxury of the DC-3, the soundproofing, the upholstered seats, the galley service, was stripped away. In its place came utility and brute strength. The transformation from airliner to warbird involved critical structural changes. The most visible was the addition of a large cargo door on the port side of the fuselage. This wasn't just a door for passengers. It was a mall wide enough to swallow a fully assembled Willys Jeep or a 37 anti-tank cannon. To accommodate such heavy loads, the floor was reinforced with heavy-duty beams. A standard airliner floor would have splintered under the weight of artillery shells or the wheels of a vehicle. The C-47's floor was built to take a beating. Up front, the cockpit received an astrodome, a clear bubble in the roof used by the navigator to shoot the stars with a sextant, essential for long-range flights over oceans or featureless deserts where radio navigation was non-existent. The demand for these machines was insatiable. The war required logistics on a planetary scale, and the C-47 was the primary delivery system. Factories in Long Beach and Santa Monica, California, ran around the clock, but they couldn't keep up. A new plant was commissioned in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, specifically to churn out the Skytrain. The output was staggering. Between March 1943 and August 1945, the Oklahoma City plant alone produced 5,354 C-47s. By the time the production lines finally halted, a total of 10,174 Skytrains had been built. Each one was powered by a pair of Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp radial engines, churning out 1,200 horsepower apiece. These air-cooled powerplants were the beating heart of the Skytrain, renowned not for blistering speed, topping out at a modest 232 miles per hour, but for a stubborn refusal to quit. They dragged the C-47 through the air with a distinctive, throaty roar that became the soundtrack of Allied logistics. With a range of 1,513 miles, the aircraft could cross continents and oceans, provided the crew could endure the journey. Inside the cockpit, the workload was shared by a pilot, a co-pilot, and a radio operator. Their office was cramped, noisy, and often freezing, but it was from this small flight deck that the war's most critical supply lines were managed. Behind them, the cargo hold was a masterclass in utilitarian design. In a standard transport configuration, the C-47 could haul 6,000 pounds of materiel. It could carry up to 28 personnel, though combat conditions often dictated a load of 18 to 22 fully equipped paratroopers, burdened as they were with leg bags and weaponry. But the plane was modular. In less than an hour, the bucket seats could be folded away or removed entirely to make room for 18 stretcher cases and a 3-person medical team, transforming the assault transport into a flying ambulance that saved countless lives by rushing the wounded to field hospitals far from the front. While the hedgerows of Normandy cemented the C-47's legacy in the public imagination, the aircraft faced perhaps its most grueling test on the other side of the world, flying the treacherous route known simply as the Hump. Beginning in April 1942, C-47s were tasked with maintaining the lifeline between India and China, supplying the Chinese nationalist forces and the U.S. 14th Air Force. The route spanned 550 miles over the Himalayas, a jagged wall of rock and ice that forced the unpressurized transports to climb to 17,000 feet, and sometimes higher, to clear the passes. At that altitude, the air is thin and lethal. Crews fought hypoxia, struggling to stay conscious while wrestling the heavy controls through violent updrafts that could flip a loaded transport on its back. The weather was a constant enemy. Monsoon rains turned to blinding snowstorms in minutes. There were no emergency landing strips in the Himalayas, only unforgiving peaks and deep jungle valleys. So many aircraft were lost to weather, mechanical failure, and Japanese interceptors that the route earned a grim nickname, the Aluminum Trail, paved with the wreckage of hundreds of crashed transports. Yet, the C-47s kept flying, hauling gasoline, munitions, and men over the roof of the world when no other route was open. Back in the European theater, the demand for the Skytrain only grew as the Allied armies pushed toward Germany. Following the success of D-Day and the invasion of southern France in Operation Dragoon, the C-47 fleet was marshaled for Operation Market Garden in September 1944. More than 1,400 Skytrains and the specialized C-53 Skytrooper variant, which lacked the reinforced floor and large cargo door, filled the skies over the Netherlands. It was a massive gamble to secure bridgeheads across the Rhine, and while the operation ultimately stalled, the C-47s proved they could deliver division-strength forces deep behind enemy lines in broad daylight. But the true measure of the C-47's worth was often found not in the massive armadas, but in the desperate, solitary missions flown when the weather was foul and the odds were long. By December 1944, the German army launched its last great offensive in the Ardennes, creating the Bulge. In the Belgian town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division, the same men the C-47s had dropped into Normandy 6 months prior, found themselves surrounded, cut off, and running critically low on ammunition and medical supplies. The weather had grounded Allied air power, shrouding the battlefield in a thick blanket of fog and snow. For days, the paratroopers held the line with dwindling resources. On December 23, the skies cleared just enough for the 441st Troop Carrier Group to attempt a resupply. It was a suicide run. The German anti-aircraft batteries ringing Bastogne were fully alert and waiting. First Lieutenant Robert L. Anstey, flying with the 302nd Troop Carrier Squadron, piloted the second aircraft in the formation. As the C-47s descended to drop altitude, slowing to a crawl to ensure the supply bundles would land within the tight American perimeter, the German flak opened up. The sky turned into a black quilt of exploding shells. Anstey held his line. In a cargo drop, evasive action is impossible. To bank or dive is to scatter the supplies into enemy hands. He had to fly straight and level through the steel storm. His aircraft took direct hits. Shrapnel tore through the aluminum skin, severing control cables and shattering instruments. With the rudder dead and the engine sputtering, Anstey and his crew fought to keep the nose up just long enough to jettison their load to the beleaguered troops below. They succeeded, but the plane was finished. Anstey crash-landed in the snow, marking the beginning of a relentless aerial siege-breaking effort. Over the coming days, hundreds of C-47s braved the flak corridor. Another aircraft, the Snafu Special of the 440th Troop Carrier Group, serial number 431573, was hammered by ground fire on December 27 while towing a glider full of explosives. Despite severe structural damage, the crew managed to limp the battered bird back to base in Orleans, France, a testament to the Skytrain's ability to fly while torn to shreds. The versatility of the C-47 extended beyond dropping men and supplies. It also pioneered the dangerous art of the glider snatch. While gliders were typically towed into the air from a runway, the Army Air Forces developed a technique to retrieve them from the ground without landing. This was the snatch pickup, a maneuver that bordered on the acrobatic and required nerves of steel from both the flight crew and the men waiting on the earth below. It turned the transport plane into a high-speed fishing reel, trawling the sky to hook a stationary target. The mechanics were deceptively simple but violent in practice. A tow rope with a loop was set up on 2 poles like a football goalpost in a clearing. The C-47 would approach at nearly 130 miles per hour, trailing a steel hook from its belly. Inside the fuselage, a massive winch drum held the cable. As the pilot dove toward the deck, he had to thread the needle, snagging the loop with the hook. Upon contact, the cable would pay out rapidly from the winch to dampen the shock, preventing the glider from being ripped apart by the sudden acceleration. In seconds, the glider would go from a standstill to flight speed, rocketing upward behind the tow plane. On March 22, 1945, near Remagen, Germany, this technique was put to a critical test. The Allies had seized the Ludendorff Bridge, but the fighting on the east bank of the Rhine was ferocious, and the wounded were piling up. The terrain was too rough for a C-47 to land, and the roads back across the river were choked with armor. The only way out for the critically injured was the sky. Second Lieutenant Gerald Bud C. Berry of the 91st Troop Carrier Squadron, part of the 439th Troop Carrier Group, volunteered for the mission. His target was a Waco CG-4A glider, sitting in a muddy pasture, filled to capacity with wounded soldiers desperate for a hospital. Barry brought his C-47A in low, the roar of the twin Pratt and Whitney engines echoing off the valley walls. He couldn't afford a mistake. A missed pass meant circling back under enemy observation, while a miscalculated altitude could drive the hook into the ground or crash the transport into the trees. As the poles flashed beneath the nose, the hook engaged. The impact shuddered through the airframe. The winch screamed as it spooled out, absorbing the energy of the heavy glider. Behind them, the Waco lurched into the air, its precious cargo of broken men suddenly airborne and en route to a hospital in France. It was a feat of precision flying that turned the C-47 from a hauler of munitions into an angel of mercy, proving that the Gooney Bird could snatch life from the jaws of death quite literally. 2 days later, on March 24, 1945, the C-47 fleet was called upon for the largest single-day airborne drop in history, Operation Varsity. The objective was to secure the east bank of the Rhine River and facilitate the final drive into the German heartland. This was not the dispersed, chaotic night drop of Normandy. This was a daylight assault, a display of overwhelming material superiority. A staggering armada of 836 C-47s, alongside hundreds of British aircraft, lifted the U.S. 17th Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne Division. The sky over the Rhine darkened with the wings of the transports. They flew in tight formation, a dual column of air power stretching back to airfields in France and England. Unlike the high-altitude flights over the Hump or the night maneuvers of D-Day, the pilots in Operation Varsity flew at treetop level to minimize their exposure to German flak, which was thick and deadly. The C-47s took punishment that would have disintegrated lesser aircraft. 20 shells punched holes through the wings, shrapnel shredded the rudders. Yet the formation held. As the jump lights flickered green, thousands of paratroopers filled the sky, descending directly onto enemy positions. The operation was costly, but it broke the back of the German defenses in the sector. The C-47 had delivered the knockout punch, ferrying the army across the last great natural barrier of the Third Reich. While the war in Europe hurtled toward its conclusion in the spring of 1945, the C-47 remained the lifeline of the Pacific Theater, where the tyranny of distance made logistics a nightmare. Here, the enemy was not just the Japanese Empire, but the geography itself. In the dense jungles of New Guinea, where roads were non-existent and footpaths could take weeks to traverse, the C-47 was the only link between civilization and the front lines. It hauled everything from bulldozers to blood plasma, landing on muddy strips carved out of the rainforest by combat engineers. But the aircraft's ubiquity also led to complacency, and the jungle was unforgiving of error. On May 13, 1945, a C-47 from the Far East Air Service Command, nicknamed the Gremlin Special, took off from Hollandia, New Guinea. It was not a combat mission. The flight was a sightseeing excursion, a morale booster intended to fly over the hidden Balam Valley, a remote, high-altitude basin surrounded by jagged peaks, inhabited by the Dani people, a civilization that had had almost no contact with the outside world. On board were 24 passengers and crew, including Women's Army Corps WAC Corporal Margaret Hastings. The mood was light, the war was winding down, and the valley, often called Shangri-La by the press, promised a glimpse of a lost world. But as the C-47 descended into the valley to give the passengers a better view, the pilots found themselves boxed in. The towering limestone walls of the valley rose faster than the laden transport could climb. The engines roared at maximum power, the propellers clawing at the thin tropical air, but it wasn't enough. The Gremlin Special slammed into the jungle-covered mountainside. The fuselage sheared apart. Fire engulfed the wreckage. Of the 24 souls on board, only 3 survived the initial impact, and the subsequent fire among the charred remains of the fuselage were Corporal Margaret Hastings of the Women's Army Corps, Lieutenant John McCollum, and Sergeant Kenneth Decker. They were battered, burned, and stranded in a place that maps had forgotten. The valley floor, lush and green, was a deceptive paradise. While the press would later romanticize the location as Shangri-La for the 3 survivors, It was a cage of high-altitude jungle surrounded by unscalable limestone peaks. Their ordeal would last for 47 days. In a bitter irony, the very aircraft that had delivered them into this isolation became their only hope for survival. While the Gremlin Special lay in ruins, other C-47s from the base in Hollandia began a daily ritual of mercy. The valley was too narrow and the ground too rough for a transport to land, so the Skytrains flew dangerously low passes, threading the needle between the canyon walls to drop medical supplies, food, and radios. The survivors, suffering from gangrene and exposure, watched as the twin-engine silhouettes roared overhead, the only link to a world that had moved on without them. The situation on the ground was complicated by the arrival of the Dani people. These indigenous tribesmen, armed with stone axes and spears, had never seen a wheel, let alone an airplane. The tension between the Stone Age warriors and the survivors of a mechanized war was palpable, yet violence was averted. But a rescue by foot was impossible. The terrain was a labyrinth of razor-sharp ridges and dense vegetation. The army had to get the survivors out by air. Once again, the C-47's unique capabilities dictated the solution. The plan called for a glider snatch, but this was not the open farmland of the Rhineland. This was a high-altitude basin with unpredictable wind shears. Paratroopers were dropped into the valley first, not to fight, but to clear a makeshift airstrip for a glider. They hacked away the elephant grass and leveled the earth by hand. On June 28, a Waco glider was towed into the valley and released, landing on the rough patch of ground. The survivors, now somewhat recovered but exhausted, were loaded inside. High above, a C-47 began its dive. The pilot had to generate enough speed to ensure the glider would achieve lift immediately upon the snatch, but the valley floor offered no room for error. If the hook missed, the C-47 would have to climb steeply to avoid the canyon wall, a maneuver that would strain the engines to their breaking point. The transport leveled out, the hook trailing. The violent jolt that rattled the teeth of everyone on board, the cable connected. The glider shot forward, accelerating from 0 to 120 miles per hour in seconds, lifting clear of the jungle canopy just as the tow plane banked hard to escape the valley. It was a triumph of airmanship and engineering, proving that the Skytrain could reach into the most inaccessible corners of the Earth to retrieve its own. As the summer of 1945 faded, so did the global conflict. The atomic bombs fell, the treaties were signed, and the great armies began to demobilize. Thousands of combat aircraft, the B-17s, the P-51s, the Lancasters, were flown to boneyards in the Arizona desert to be chopped into scrap aluminum. They were weapons of war, purpose-built for destruction, and had little place in a world at peace. But the C-47 was different. It was a builder, a hauler, a lifeline. The world was broken, cities were leveled, and populations were starving. The logistics of reconstruction required the same rugged reliability that had supplied the hedgerows and the jungle. The Gooney Bird did not retire, it simply changed its cargo. The olive drab paint was often stripped away to reveal polished aluminum, and the military designations were swapped for civilian registrations. The C-47 reverted to the DC-3, becoming the backbone of the burgeoning commercial air travel industry, bringing flight to corners of the globe that had never seen a paved runway. Yet, the Cold War would soon demand the Skytrain return to uniform. In June 1948, the Soviet Union blockaded the fierce geopolitical island of West Berlin, cutting off all road, rail, and canal access. 2 million civilians were trapped, facing starvation and a winter without coal. The only way in was through 3 narrow air corridors. General Lucius D. Clay, the military governor, ordered an airlift, Operation Vittles. The C-47 was the first to respond. On June 26, 1948, the first Skytrains, laden with flour and medicine, touched down at Tempelhof Airport. It was a logistical operation of unprecedented scale. While the larger 4-engine C-54 Skymasters eventually took over the bulk of the heavy lifting, the C-47s were the pioneers of the bridge. They flew around the clock, in weather that grounded lesser aircraft, navigating the tight approach corridors between Soviet fighter patrols and treacherous fog. At the height of the airlift, a plane was landing in Berlin every 3 minutes. The roar of the Pratt and Whitney radial engines became the sound of freedom for the besieged Berliners. The pilots, many of whom had dropped paratroopers to kill Germans just 4 years earlier, were now flying to save them. The raisin bombers, as the German children called them, dropped candy attached to tiny parachutes on final approach. The C-47 had completed its transformation from a chariot of invasion to a symbol of humanitarian aid. The longevity of the airframe defies the logic of aerospace engineering. Most aircraft from the 1940s are museum pieces, fragile artifacts kept behind velvet ropes. The C-47 remains a working machine. Its design was so robust, so over-engineered that it refused to become obsolete. The wing structure, a multicellular box design, provided immense strength and redundancy. If a spar failed, the load simply transferred to another part of the wing. The landing gear, with its massive tires and oleo struts, could handle grass, gravel, ice, and pierced steel planking with equal indifference. Pilots often joked that the only replacement for a DC-3 was another DC-3. It was a forgiving aircraft, one that communicated with its crew. It shuddered before a stall, giving ample warning to a distracted pilot. It could fly on one engine, albeit with a heavy foot on the rudder, and it could glide for miles if both powerplants failed. It was an honest machine. By the time production ceased, the factories in California and Oklahoma had birthed over 10,000 of these giants. They served in every theater of World War II, from the ice of the Aleutians to the sands of North Africa. They bore the markings of the U.S. Army Air Forces, the Royal Air Force, the Soviet Air Force, and dozens of other nations. They carried generals and privates, ammunition and mail, the wounded and the dead. General Eisenhower's assessment of the C-47 as one of the 4 pillars of victory was not hyperbole. The bazooka, the jeep, and the atomic bomb were tools of specific utility. The C-47 was the circulatory system of the Allied war effort. Without it, the paratroopers at Normandy would have been infantry without a ride. The Marines in the Pacific would have been isolated on their island chains. The armies in the Ardennes would have run out of bullets. In the end, the legacy of the C-47 Skytrain is not found in a single battle or a specific statistic. It is found in the jagged, ice-rimmed peaks of the Himalayas, along a 550-mile gauntlet of granite and wind shear known as the Hump. Here, the enemy was not the Luftwaffe, but the atmosphere itself. To keep the supply lines open from India to China, the C-47 was forced to operate at the very limits of its design envelope. These aircraft, unpressurized and often overloaded with gasoline drums and munitions, had to claw their way up to 17,000 feet to clear the mountain passes. At that altitude, the air is thin and the cold is absolute. Inside the cockpit, frost formed on the instruments. Crews sucked on oxygen hoses, their movements sluggish in the sub-zero cabin, while the twin Pratt and Whitney engines struggled for every revolution in the rarefied air. The route was unforgiving. Navigation aids were primitive, and the weather could shift from clear skies to a blinding monsoon in minutes. So many aircraft were lost, slamming into cloud-shrouded ridges or icing up and spinning into the abyss, that the route earned a grim moniker, the Aluminum Trail, paved with the scattered wreckage of hundreds of transports. Yet the tonnage moved. The C-47's flying the Hump proved that the Gooney Bird could function in environments that would ground a more temperamental machine. It was a logistical triumph built on the nerves of pilots who flew day after day over terrain where a forced landing was a death sentence. While the Hump crews battled the elements in Asia, the transport groups in Europe faced a different kind of storm in the winter of 1944. As the year drew to a close, the German army launched its desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes, encircling the 101st Airborne Division at the crossroads town of Bastogne, Belgium. The Screaming Eagles, the very men the C-47s had dropped into Normandy 6 months prior, were now cut off, low on ammunition and freezing in the snow. General George Patton's Third Army was fighting to break through, but time was running out. The only way to keep the 101st fighting was from the air. For days, heavy overcast grounded the Allied air forces. But on December 23, 1944, the skies cleared, and the C-47s were cleared for one of the most dangerous missions of the war. This was not a high-altitude run. This was a low-level resupply dropped directly into the teeth of the German anti-aircraft concentrations surrounding the town. First Lieutenant Robert L. Anstey, flying with the 441st Troop Carrier Group, was second in formation that morning. The mission profile called for the transports to fly slow and straight to ensure the supply bundles landed within the tight American perimeter. It made them perfect targets. As Anstey's aircraft approached the drop zone, the German flak batteries opened up. The sky turned black with bursting shells. Tracers zipped past the cockpit glass. The C-47, lacking self-sealing fuel tanks or armor plating, relied entirely on the pilot's ability to hold formation through the carnage. Anstey's plane took a direct hit. The impact severed the rudder cables, rendering the tail control useless. Smoke began to fill the cabin. In a modern aircraft, this would be the moment of ejection, but the C-47 was a stick-end rudder machine. Fighting the yoke, Anstey and his co-pilot struggled to keep the crippled bird level long enough to jettison their cargo. They were going down, but the supplies had to go first. They managed to crash-land the burning transport in a field. It was a testament to the ruggedness of the Douglas design that the crew survived the impact, though they were immediately captured by German forces. Their sacrifice, and the sacrifice of dozens of other crews that day, delivered the critical ammunition and medical supplies that allowed the 101st to hold Bastogne until Patton's tanks broke through. The punishment absorbed by these airframes during the Battle of the Bulge was staggering. 4 days later, on December 27, another C-47, this one nicknamed Snafu Special, and belonging to the 440th Troop Carrier Group, was towing a glider laden with dynamite during Operation Repulse. As it neared the release point, German ground fire shredded the fuselage. Shrapnel tore through the hydraulic lines and punched holes in the wings. Despite the catastrophic damage, the pilots released the glider on target and wrestled the Snafu Special back to base in Orleans, France. The aircraft was a sieve, but it was still flying. To sustain this global hemorrhage of aluminum and steel, the American home front had to achieve a miracle of production. The sheer ubiquity of the C-47, the fact that it could be losing tails in Belgium, crashing in New Guinea, and freezing over the Himalayas simultaneously, was due to the relentless output of the assembly lines. While the factories in Long Beach and Santa Monica, California, churned out thousands of airframes, it was the plant in Oklahoma City that became the beating heart of the transport fleet. Between March 1943 and August 1945, the Oklahoma City facility alone produced 5,354 C-47s. It was a feat of industrial engineering that bordered on alchemy. Raw bauxite was mined, refined into aluminum, rolled into sheets, and riveted into the shape of a Skytrain at a rate that the Axis powers could not comprehend. This unyielding flood of machinery meant that, for every transport down by enemy fire, a replacement was already waiting to take to the skies. Such logistical supremacy shrank the globe, ensuring that wherever the Allies advanced, the Skytrain was there to sustain them. In the end, the C-47 did not just carry cargo, it carried the momentum of the entire war effort on its wings. If you would like more war stories from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.